So we'll start today's chat, if everybody can see this, just by learning a little bit more about ARPA from Civilytics founder and president Jared Knowles. He is a wealth of knowledge and with a lot of great information to share, so buckle up. And next we have District D City Councilor Emily Izzo, who is also a member of Watertown's Committee on Budget and Fiscal Oversight. And she'll update us on Watertown's deliberations around ARPA so far. And we'll have an opportunity for a brief Q&A before we break into groups to do some good old-fashioned brainstorming and come back together to briefly share some of these discussion ideas. So as you listen to Emily and Jared today, and anybody else who might be sharing information, we encourage you to keep these three questions in the back of your mind. How much should we invest? What do we spend it on? And who benefits? Those are sort of the three things that we're hoping to keep in our minds today as we go through this discussion within the guidelines that we learn about from Jared and Emily. And we are very grateful to have both of them with us today. And I would like to also add that all council members on the BFO committee would have loved to join us today. However, in compliance with open meeting law, only one council member could attend. So councilors Vinnie Piccirilli and Nicole Gardner are the other two members of the BFO committee, but they both extend their greetings and their gratitude for your interest on the topic, and they will look forward to watching this reporting after we post the link. So very quickly, I think by now everyone's pretty familiar with Zoom etiquette, which we will be following. The basics: raise your hand to be recognized, and please mute yourself if you're not speaking, just to limit background noise. The chat function is always open to everybody and can be used for comments and questions. We don't have a designated chat monitor today, but Tia and I will do our best to get to your questions as quickly as possible, as well as link any relevant documents and articles throughout the meeting. And I know we have a lot of other local leaders here in attendance today. So if anyone sees a question that they know the answer to, please feel free to share resources amongst yourselves and answer questions. That's always very helpful and interesting for us to read later, because we do take the time to read through the chat comments and questions carefully after each meeting to make sure that we didn't miss anything. And above all, we ask people to bring their curiosity, listen with an open mind, and be mindful of the time so that everybody can be heard. And I think that covered everything. I'm pretty sure. Without further ado, I am going to hand the talking stick to my dear colleague, Tia, who will bring us into the first part of our meeting with Jared.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Janice. And thank you all for carving out some time this afternoon. It's great to see you all. As Janice mentioned, we've got the members of the Budget, Finance, and Oversight Committee. Only one could be here today, Nicole and Councilor Gardner and Councilor Palumba. Councilor Piccirilli wish they could be here. I do want to recognize that Councilor Palumba is here with us today, and we're delighted to have him. Today, we've got two speakers, and we've got Jared Knowles. Jared is a Watertown resident, the founder and president of Civilytics Consulting, and he's here to provide an overview of ARPA funding. He's, as I mentioned, a Watertown resident. He's passionate about helping people in communities use data to understand simple questions.
Yeah.
If everybody could mute, that would be great. Thank you. Jared earned his PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is a former research analyst for the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. He founded Civilytics Consulting in 2016 to provide high-quality performance metrics for government services that are comparable nationwide. And thank you so much for joining us, Jared. And so for the next bit of time, Jared's going to be our resource. And we also have a wealth of experience around the room. I can see, members of our city government, members of other organizations in town who are here today. And we've asked Jared to address, what is ARPA? How much does Watertown have? What can it be spent on? What's off limits? What are the guidelines? And as much as possible to understand what are some comparable communities and what have they done? How have other communities spent their funding, and have they yet to spend their funding? So without further ado, Jared, we're going to pass that talking stick to you. And thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much, Tia and Janice, for that warm welcome and for bringing all these folks together. I'm really excited to be here. A couple other things about me. I think it's always good to know a little bit about the person you're about to get advice and information from. My company has done a lot of ARPA advocacy work with groups across the country. And so we speak to community groups about what is possible with ARPA. And I take that as, it's very important to say that I take a political science perspective, not a legal perspective. So I've often been presenting about ARPA on a panel where there may be attorneys or people who are representing that perspective who maybe have a narrower view of what's possible with ARPA than I do. So you should be aware that I adopt a liberal interpretation of what's allowed in ARPA based on what has been done with ARPA funds already across the country, what I've seen done, and sort of how the politics around the use of ARPA funds have played out. A lot of what you're going to see today, I did a project for Barnstable County. They hired our company to do a landscape assessment of ARPA funds in Barnstable County and alignment with funds available across the Commonwealth. So I'm going to discuss some other federal funding streams that are coming to Watertown or to Massachusetts as well, because I think it's important to consider ARPA in the larger context of other resources that are available to solve the challenges that the community identifies. So we may all agree that we need to solve problem X, but there may be 4 funding sources that can solve problem X, including ARPA, and we should maybe look at the other ones as well. So that's another point. I do have some slides, so I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to walk through these slides. Also, all the information I'm going to present is also available on my website, and I'll drop a link in that. That's materials that are put together for community groups to basically take and use in advocacy with their community. So they're made to be very accessible, and I hope you find them useful if that is something you're looking for. So. A little bit about my history with ARPA. So I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that I do 100% know what I'm talking about, in that when ARPA came out, it's unprecedented in that it's the first time in my lifetime, probably many of our lifetimes, the federal government gave unrestricted aid to every single government in the United States. So there's roughly 80,000 governments operated inside the United States, state and local governments. And the federal government has never really given unrestricted aid to these governments before. Usually we get restricted aid or grant programs, right? And the formula the federal government used for towns the size of ARPA had a mistake in it that led to $5 billion being misallocated between states. And we caught this, and it was published in the national media. Chuck Schumer was asked about it, kind of punted on it, but the level of, I just want you to know the level of detail and care that I put into reading the ARPA statute and the ARPA regulations to find that. I'm going to be bringing that to you here. And the reason I did all that was to help get the word out very early on about ARPA because of this unrestricted nature of this aid. It's both a benefit and a problem for communities. It's a problem in that we have to figure out what to do with it. And there's no guidelines or rules in ARPA about how to identify what to spend the money on. There's lots of discussion about what it could be spent on, but we're not given a process. So that's what we're all on this call on our Sunday afternoon here to discuss, is what does that process look like, and what do we want to see in there. And so you can read more about that if you're interested, but I wanted you to just have that as context. And when we're talking about ARPA, I want to just make clear, ARPA had many other things in it. We're usually talking about, actually here today, we're talking about the state and local fiscal recovery funds program, which is that unrestricted aid to local governments. It was about $350 billion, and it was divided up by formulas to different types of local governments. But the school system, which Watertown also operates, also received through ARPA emergency and secondary school emergency relief funds. And those were allocated to the school as well. So those are more restricted than the state and local fiscal recovery funds because they need to be spent on certain educational activities. And so you can look those up and see about that. But it also funded other things like the emergency rental assistance program, you may have heard about assistance for nutrition, housing, childcare, and other things. But we're talking now, when we talk about ARPA in the budget of Watertown, we're talking about the state and local fiscal recovery funds. Most of these other programs have been expended, so their money's been spent. And in fact, a lot of communities across the country have spent their state and local fiscal recovery funds as well. But Watertown has not yet. So we still have time to talk about it. There are sort of 4 available uses listed under the ARPA regulations for these funds. So respond to public health emergency and its economic impact, provide government services that were reduced due to revenue decreases. This does not apply to Watertown. Watertown's revenue did not decrease during the pandemic, so Watertown cannot claim a revenue loss. So we actually can't use this as our funding category. Make investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure, or provide premium pay for essential workers. You'll hear the timeline multiple times, but the
Slides.
what?
Jared, I don't think everybody can see your slides. We're just seeing that first agenda slide.
Oh, interesting. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Let me just change this for a second here.
Sure. Take your time. I think he froze.
Uh,
Oh, there you are.
am I here now?
We
Okay,
still
good.
see that first slide, but you'd frozen for a second.
Let me just stop the share and restart it.
Thank you for noticing that.
Yes, thank you for speaking up. Now, should we see my slides, right? All right, great.
Yes.
That'll make make a lot more sense what I'm talking about. Okay, thank you. Yes. Here's what the other slides look like. You can have a copy of these as well afterward, and you can definitely read them. But yeah, these are the sort of categories, and I just was saying about the timing. The timing that matters now for Watertown is that Watertown needs to report to the federal government that it has earmarked all of the money to be spent by December 31st, 2024. So it needs to list out what the intention is to spend it on, even if the checks haven't cleared. And all of the checks have to cleared, and the money has to be out of the bank account by December 31st, 2026. So that's the clock that Watertown is under. And that is a very real limitation on some of the options of what Watertown can do. That is starting to become a timeline is starting to become an issue at this point. A few things that are ARPA adjacent, and these things I bring up because they can cause confusion about what we're talking about this money being spent for. There was a lot of pandemic relief programs, right? And a lot of times people think the CARES Act and ARPA are the same, but they're very different. So even though they were both pandemic relief programs, ARPA explicitly made available funds for recovery and for reinvestment in order to sort of make resilient for the next pandemic or the next crisis. The CARES Act was very much limited to spending money on mitigating the effects of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. So we don't want to conflate the money that Watertown has now is not the same, is not CARES Act money, and it has many more broad uses available to it. ESSER is the kind of equivalent funding stream, but it's for the school systems. Then to make things a little more confusing, we also passed an infrastructure bill several months after ARPA. And the infrastructure bill has a lot of overlapping programs as well. Specifically, the infrastructure bill will include a lot of funding for water and sewer and broadband build out programs, which are also authorized uses of the funds we're talking about under ARPA. And then this was more relevant 6 months ago when I made these slides, but now I don't know. There was the Build Back Better agenda. There was some talk about big federal programs coming through for that as well in the federal budget, but we don't know what those are at this moment. It's easier to think about for an average citizen who wants to do something nice in their community. It's easier to think about the things you can't do with ARPA than it is to think about the things you can. And I'm going to hopefully motivate this idea in a couple ways. The first thing is there's only two things. Now there's been a couple others in regulations that Treasury explicitly forbid the money from being used for. So states can't use them to offset tax cuts, and no government can use them to pay unfunded pension liabilities. There was a separate bailout fund for some pension funds that was in the ARPA bill, but you can't say, oh, we haven't paid our public employee pension fund for 10 years. We're going to use the ARPA money to backfill that. That's not an allowable use under ARPA. Other things are allowed. So I'm going to talk about some of those other things. There's two tiers of use. There's things you can do no matter where you are in your city, and that's if you're responding to public health needs or addressing the negative economic impacts. If you can justify that those are the things you're doing with the money, you can do those things across your whole community. You can do an additional set of flexible things if you can demonstrate that you're serving the hardest hit communities and families. The Treasury regulations and the law are very flexible about what is defined as the hardest hit communities and families. Treasury gives some ideas of ways you could do this. Many of these won't qualify in Watertown. One is a qualified census tract, which is a HUD designation from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Watertown, I believe, does not have a qualified census tract in its boundaries. But basically anything you spend money on in a qualified census tract is an allowable use because it's considered responding to negative economic impacts and serving the hardest hit communities. We can't replace lost public sector revenue in Watertown because we didn't lose public sector revenue. And we could provide premium pay for essential workers. This is allowed. You can do back pay. So you can pay essential workers who are working from 2020 to 2022. You can pay them in 2024 and say this is a long overdue bonus for that service that you provided to your community during that time. And essential workers do not have to be employees of the city. They can be essential workers who work in the boundaries of the city and work in functions as broad as grocery store employees, restaurant and food preparation, who kept us fed and did delivery when we didn't want to leave our homes and eat at a restaurant. So the definition there is actually broader than just public employees. And then, of course, there's water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure with some rules around what would count for that. I'm actually going to skip this because I think it might be more interesting for questions. I just want to bring up show the timeline visually. Now, I'll just take off my expert hat and put on my Watertown resident hat. I personally wish we would have started this process a little earlier because you can see that Watertown actually received its first payment from the ARPA program in May of 2021. And so, you know, it's 2023 now. We are still in what I generously call the zone of opportunity on this slide. But the zone of opportunity is sliding past us. We need to decide things quickly because we have to obligate the funds by December 2024. We have to pay those funds out by December 2026. And for some things which we might imagine and know that our community needs, we need some lead time to do those things well and spend that money well. I'm going to skip this infrastructure spending. My main point, the Infrastructure Act, you'll hear a lot about it. It funds many things, but a lot of its funding, it's not the same as ARPA in that a lot of its funding will be passed down to Watertown or be made available to Watertown through the Commonwealth, through the Department of Environmental Quality or through other state agencies, right? And the Watertown would have to apply. That's very different than ARPA, where the money is in a bank account controlled by the city now. And so those are very different fiscal situations. So while they both may be eligible to fund the same program, one gives Watertown a lot more freedom about pursuing that program. And that's an important dimension to consider when thinking about how to use the money. So the last thing I was asked to kind of talk about is what are people doing about ARPA around the country? So like I said, I've gone to maybe a dozen community meetings virtually by Zoom and a couple in person with groups like yourselves asking exactly these questions, thinking about what they would like to do and asking their city leaders to do these things. So just some ideas about what's been going on around the country. First, let's talk about how people are finding out what they should do. Because the first question is, how do we know what we should use this money for? Well, in Detroit, they held 65 public meetings to discuss priorities about ARPA within the first year of the ARPA funds being available. They collected over 700 surveys, and they took on the challenge and achieved it to say that they decided to make it the largest community engagement effort that they'd ever done. In Wayne County, which is the county that Detroit is in, but it's a separate government, their economic development team held over 100 meetings with commissioners, with the 43 municipalities within the county, with county departments, business stakeholders, and nonprofits about how to use funds, including listening sessions in all of the county supervisors' districts. Chicago held regional roundtables with community-based and neighborhood-based organizations. They asked participants to complete a budget worksheet and specify which programs and services they would prioritize for investment. And they hosted focus groups with specific segments and stakeholders inside their community to advise the city's advisory boards and engagement in the Equity Council. So those are some ways that different cities, these are large cities, obviously, but they did take a serious effort to really get community input. There's a flip side. Some communities spent all of this money in their budget without any community input at all. And the one I like to talk about that one is Dallas, Texas. They did not do any community engagement process. They offset a lot of it from revenue loss, and they spent a lot of it without any community engagement. Both of those things are allowed under ARPA. There's no rules from Treasury about how to do community engagement. But let's talk about what some people did. To tackle affordable housing and houselessness, Los Angeles County is spending now they have a large ARPA allocation, as you can imagine. They're spending $100 million to buy hotels, $100 million to convert county-owned buildings into housing, and $100 million to construct new prefabricated housing. Those are all allowed uses under ARPA. Detroit's replacing 1,000 roofs for low-income seniors and homeowners with disabilities so they can stay in their homes and have the quality of their housing lifted up. San Diego County is providing up to $7,000 vouchers to assist renters who are unable to pay for a security deposit, to allow people to kind of move around and resort or find new housing that better suits their living conditions. You can improve childcare for families and workers. So you could provide training and startup funding to people who want to launch a childcare provider business. So Los Angeles County is doing that. New Jersey is giving grants to existing family childcare providers and licensed centers to expand their operations or to retain staff. San Diego County is paying people for the training and credentials required to join to become a childcare worker. So if you live in San Diego County and you want to become a childcare worker, you can receive a stipend out of the ARPA funding in order to get that training. New Jersey and Seattle are giving childcare workers bonuses. They were an essential service and they're getting bonuses. There are places, Orange County, Florida is making childcare free or giving vouchers to people who earn less than 300% of the federal poverty guideline to offset the costs of childcare and allow people to get access to childcare. A few other great ideas. Phoenix is just giving people money. This program is an extremely easy program to administer. It costs $12 million a year to provide 1,000 families with $1,000 a month for 12 months, and that's what Phoenix is doing. Reno County is giving premium pay to housekeepers, case managers, and other staff at the regional low barrier homeless shelter to recognize the immense service that they put in during the COVID-19 crisis. Home visiting services are being provided to high-risk, low-income, pregnant, and parenting families in LA County. A living room treatment model in Bernalillo County is providing treatment for people in their homes for substance abuse and addiction. So they don't have to go to a treatment center. They have people come to the home. And there's a bunch of other ideas. I'm not endorsing any of these ideas. What I'm trying to show you is the very broad spectrum of things that communities have chosen. You know, Watertown may not choose that it needs to provide premium pay to housekeepers, but we should make that choice knowing that we could do that if we want to, but we don't need to. And so showing some of this broad spectrum, I hope, is a way to kind of spark the imagination and demonstrate some of the really creative uses that different communities are coming up to. There's some links on my website to other eligible uses, including some other examples of different communities doing things and some prices for some of the programs that people are doing. One that I think is like very simple but really interesting is using the water eligibility to make public water accessible. So water fountains, bottle filling stations, this kind of infrastructure that makes it easier for people to go outside and be outside and stay outside. Very, very encouraged by ARPA, and something that a community can do. So the last thing, and then I'll be done and be available for questions, is just to compare ARPA to some of the other things along some of these broad categories. And the main thing to highlight here is that there are other programs coming that are going to fund water and sewer and broadband services, namely the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. I don't know how it'll work out in the Commonwealth. The legislature's been pretty slow on their end to make that money available, to describe what's going to happen with it. So, a bird in the hand might be worth two in the bush in this case, but this is another set of resources that are coming to help address these challenges in Watertown and across the Commonwealth. But there aren't other funding programs available really for affordable housing and the housing supply. There's limited funding for business recovery left. There's limited funding for early education and childcare left. And so if those were priorities or things that the community really wanted to do, it wouldn't be wise to wait for the infrastructure spending or a future federal budget to solve those problems when there's money in hand now that could solve those problems. And that's really what ARPA represents. It's money in hand to start solving some of these problems that hasn't been available for these types of problems or community solutions in a long time. And so that's why it's great that you're all here and willing to participate and have this conversation. Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing my slides. That's all I have for now, but I'm happy to be around, answer any questions, and I'll put a link to those resources in the chat for those of you who'd like to review them.
That's terrific, Jared. Thank you so much. We will take questions, but what I'd like to do is introduce Councillor Izzo, who will speak to kind of what Watertown is doing and where we are with Watertown, and then I will open the floor up for some questions before we go into breakout groups. Emily, I'd like to introduce Councillor Emily Rizzo to give an update on Watertown's approach and timing to allocate our funding. Councillor Rizzo represents District D in the West End, a lifelong Watertown resident, former Chief of Staff for Representative John Lawn. Emily is a municipal tax and finance law attorney for Massachusetts. And thank you for joining us today, Emily.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So my name's Emily Izzo. I'm the District D City Councilor, and I'm just here to walk you through the process Watertown will be going through when spending our ARPA funding. So Watertown is receiving about $10.5 million in funding from the federal government. It's a one-time pot of money, and it's federal aid to respond to the public health and economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. The funds have to be encumbered by 12/31/24 and spent by 12/31/26. So the Committee on Budget and Fiscal Oversight, otherwise known as the BFO, has been tasked with coming up with a plan to spend this $10.5 million. On the committee is Vice President of the Council, Vinnie Piccirilli, who is the chair of the committee, Councilor Gardner, who is the secretary, and myself, and I serve as the vice chair of that committee. So far, the BFO has had 2 meetings regarding ARPA, and they've just been sort of preliminary planning meetings to try and decide the process we'll be going through. We're trying to make this as open and transparent as possible, and we hope the public is very involved. The first step we will be taking is the educational portion of this process. So on February 1st, from 7 to 9 p.m. in the council chamber, Hannah York from Clifton, Larson and Allen, Hannah is a CPA and specializes in this topic. She'll be coming to Watertown, and it will also be a hybrid meeting too. And Watertown Cable Access will also be there. So there'll be opportunities to catch this meeting if you cannot make it on the 1st. But basically, Ms. York is just going to be explaining sort of what ARPA is and what are the allowable uses, similar to Jared's presentation just now. But the public will then have an opportunity for Q&A with Ms. York. And then following this, we are envisioning, I think someone put it in the chat already, but we have a website dedicated to ARPA. But we're obviously going to add more things to it, including hopefully Hannah York's presentation. We're hoping to also include a one-pager, which sort of summarizes everything in a simple manner. And then perhaps a link to a larger ARPA document. And we're planning on a 2-month period where the public can sort of submit requests for how they would like to see these funds spent. And then we also would like to work with CLA on setting up a standard form for everyone who would request funds, essentially just asking everyone the same question, basically getting to how much of the funds are you asking for and how will the funds be spent. The committee is also going to meet before I think that 2-month period opens after this February 1st meeting, where we will ideally be coming up with a rubric for how the committee decides to allocate the funds, which the public will be able to hopefully see that rubric. And then once the proposals are all submitted and that 2-month window closes, then the committee will then make recommendations for how the funds should be spent, come up with a committee report, and then it goes back to the full council for a vote. I am excited that Watertown is starting this process to spend these funds. This is a great opportunity. And also at the last meeting we had, which was last week, I learned something pretty helpful, which was when it says that the funds have to be spent by 12/31/26, it means that they actually have to be physically gone. So we can't, this is purely hypothetical, the council can't say, let's give $1 million to the Boys and Girls Club, and then they just keep it and sit on it. They have to actually physically spend that money we give them on a certain project or a program. They have to physically be spent. So this is exciting, and it's an opportunity for the public to become very engaged. Maybe not as engaged as Detroit was with 65 meetings, but hopefully people are active and participate and make requests. And I'm excited to see what the public would like to see this spent on.
Thank you so much, Councillor Izzo. My apologies for naming you as Rizzo.
It's okay.
You can talk to me about being named Tina as well. So thank you so much. That's really helpful information. What I'd like to do is open the floor for about 10 minutes for questions to both you, Councillor Izzo, and Jared Knowles. And then what we will do then is go into breakout groups and to kick around some ideas a bit, and we'll give a little bit more guidance around that. But right now, what I do is like to open the floor to questions. Does anybody have questions for our speakers about what they've heard tonight, guidelines, process? I see Tony and then Bob Shea.
Thank you. I have a quick question for Emily. Emily, during that 2-month period, should people begin to submit ideas once they get the form that is going to come from the consultants, or should they wait until we get the rubric a month in from the council, from the committee?
So I spoke to the Chairman Piccirilli, who said after that February 1st meeting, the committee will hopefully be having another committee meeting just to sort of set everything up so that the public can have all the documents once that 2-month period opens. I don't know when that 2-month period is going to open, whether it's February 2nd or maybe like a week or two later once we have all those documents. I think it would be best if everyone had every single document available to them on the website so that everyone making requests has the same information in front of them, but we'll see.
Okay. And Jared, I'd ask you a question. You mentioned earlier that some of the ARPA money, which was, I forget the term you used for the state and local, sort of like state and local discretionary funds, but you said some of the ARPA money was earmarked for things like childcare and other areas, and that most of that has been expended. Does that if you were a recipient of that money, of ARPA money for specific things, does that eliminate you as potentially receiving some of this state and local money?
No, they're just completely separate programs, very independent. Yep.
Okay,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you very much. I see Bob, Connie Henry, Marcy Mourniham, and Nancy. So Bob?
Yeah, it seems that the establishment of the rubric is a key milestone here and really needs to be done. What's going to be the process? Is that going to be an open process with the committee, or are they going to do that?
Yeah, no, we'll have a BFO meeting, and the public will be welcome to join, just like a regular meeting, setting up sort of, I guess, an RFP, which is known as a request for proposal process, where you have everything in front of you to see how we're going to take into account your requests. So hopefully we get that up as soon as possible, and that will be an open meeting when we set that rubric up.
It would seem to me that needs to be the first meeting you hold.
Yeah.
Because you can't do the application documents, et cetera, and people won't know what the framework is. And I suspect it's going to be more than one meeting because it's complicated.
Right. Yeah, we hopefully get that up as soon as possible, and then open that 2-month window.
And Jared, are there available frameworks, rubrics available from other communities that you know of that would be useful for us to have to start that process?
No, I
Oh.
don't think so. There's not a very good repository of that kind of thing, actually. I think this is a sort of problem. There's a coordination problem. I can't remember if the League of Municipalities in Massachusetts had put one out, but as you can imagine, choosing the rubric is sort of saying what's important in your community, or it influences it quite a bit. So whose rubric you used would also be probably something you'd want to very strongly consider. There's one I like from the Southern Economic Advancement Project, but you and I might not agree that that is the right rubric to use. So, you know, there isn't a sort of clearinghouse of them that I'm aware of.
So you made the point exactly that what the committee decides on as the community's priorities for this is going to be pretty dispositive of what gets chosen. So just for everybody else on the call, we need to make sure that attendance is good at that meeting or those meetings.
Great. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks.
Connie, Marcy, Nancy, and then Elodia.
Hi, this is so informative. So I left my Watertown Faces Climate Change meeting to come to this. And but the meeting, a lot of people wanted to be here. I just wanted to note that. So I'm trying to represent the group well. And we started talking about if we wanted to make recommendations, what might they be? And so this might be a 2-piece. So we're thinking about things like piloting a micro transit for the elderly and youth and low-income residents. We're thinking about subsidies for electrification. Many different things are possible. These are things that would have long-term benefits for our community. And so my question is for Jared. Do you know of ways in which different communities use this to affect resilience and mitigation of climate issues that affect low-income people disproportionately?
A couple of examples I can think of are, I do a lot of work with community group in Phoenix. So I'm very familiar with their work. Phoenix has funded a lot of heat mitigation grants to low-income communities. And it's also trying to fully fund it. In 2010, it had a goal of tree canopy cover that is woefully behind. So it's trying to accelerate it's catching up to that with some of its ARPA funds, and it's also funding an Office of Heat Resiliency and Mitigation, I think is the title of the office. So that's like a 2-year office inside the city government that's coordinating heat mitigation activities. That's like one of the bigger ones that I can think of, but I'm sure that a lot of projects related to water management and stormwater management have been funded with ARPA. It's actually kind of tricky to find out the very specifics, but I think that that's also a very common use of the funding. So I think it's fairly it's fairly prevalent that communities use at least some of their ARPA funds in that domain.
Can I just ask a tag on, which is, have they used it also for pilot studies? Like piloting a study for a microgrid using geothermal or something like that? Or have people used it for pilots?
I think you might actually have a little trouble justifying a study under ARPA because it's not responding. You might have to justify that it is actually responsive to the economic impact because it's sort of an indirect response.
Okay,
So
thank you.
I haven't seen things like that, although I'm sure there's a creative way you could do something like that, but it would be small. And I usually only see the sort of large allocations. There's a lot of room for small things, but you will learn that, and Watertown will benefit from this, is the Treasury reporting requirements are fairly light, whatever they may tell you. So that's a benefit when you're wanting to do this stuff, but it's a downside if you want to learn from other communities because you can't really go in and get all the information you'd like.
Thank you, Jared. I want to make sure we get everybody's questions in. So Connie, is it okay if I move on?
Yeah, oh, yes.
Great, thank you. Marcy?
Yeah, hi, everybody. Happy New Year, and thank you, Watertown Forward, and thank you to Jared and Emily for helping us to understand what's going on here. My question, I want to build on what Bob Shea asked and also what Connie asked. And I think that the frame of meaning, the framework, the rubric, aside from the what, because when you put a pile of money out there, there are going to be a lot of people coming, you know, like ants. Folks are going to have all kinds of ideas and asks and so on, which is great. But I'm wondering about the why. And it seems to me that Watertown is poised to make some history again here in the context of the recently voter approved revisions to the city charter. In my mind, the preamble serves as a statement of principles and values. The voters approve something that speaks to Watertown will support an ethic of civic and environmental stewardship, the principles of safety and tranquility, education and excellence, equity and diversity, health and well-being, creativity and innovation, accountability and transparency, and then the related narrative. That's an investment statement. That's a statement of purpose. And I am thinking that there's an opportunity here in setting up the rubric. It's not just a clinical list of, you know, laundry list of preferences and goals, but really within the context, they're measured against the professed values of the town, at least insofar as what community means, and that ethic and guiding principles. I think there's a way of framing these and then measuring ideas against how much does it, you know, advance this or that, so that we start to develop this fluency in talking about values in public life as well as specific projects.
So putting values within the rubric, I think that's a great idea, Marcy. Thank you. Nancy, are you gonna, or should I move on?
Yes. Why don't you move on, and I'm going to put my, in the interest of time, I'm going to put my question in the chat.
Terrific. Thank you. Elodia?
Oops. Thank you, Tia. I just wanted to add that in one of the meetings, George Proakis, our city manager, did say that he would be asking for suggestions from the consultant to look at communities that had roughly the same amount of money, maybe a little less, maybe a little bit more, because the examples that Jared gave are all major cities with really big bucks. It's 10.5 million. It sounds like a whole lot of money, but when you start looking at things, it's not a whole lot of money. So George, did take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Elodia. Yeah, Jared had put some kind of calibration in the chat that our tax base is 145 million annually. So it's in my family, we would call this yay money. So, what can you do with a little extra sponge, a little extra, cushion to be innovative, be thoughtful, to address needs. So thank you. These have been great questions and comments, and really appreciate it. Questions are still coming in the chat. And what I'm going to do is continue to load them. And what we'll do is we'll come back to them in discussion. Because what I'd like to do now is take what we know. Actually, I'm going to look at them quickly. These might be helpful to answer, to address now before we go into the groups. Bob has asked whether the city has applied for funds for water and sewer improvements from the infrastructure bill, so that their application for half of the ARPA funds would be available for other projects. So what Bob is referencing is the DPW has put in a proposal for half the ARPA funds already. And he's asking whether whether the city's applied for any of the other infrastructure funds on this. Do any, Councilor Izzo, Councilor Palamba, would anybody have an answer to that at this point? I'm seeing Tony shake his head no. Emily, there you are on screen.
I do not know.
Okay, fine. That's something we can find out.
Yeah.
And then Nancy's asked, is there any way, and this is directed to you, Emily, whether the BFO process could include a way for residents to submit requests for information? So requests for information that might help determine the merits of various ideas.
Yeah, so that is something I could recommend including maybe like a place to put a question on that website that we're hoping to set up with the IT department. One thing that was also being considered was sort of maybe like some areas for ideas where citizens who might not know where to make their suggestion might say, hey, these are areas that we could spend it on that might be helpful, whether it's sewer rate relief or whatever. But here it is. Here's some ideas if you do not have any off the top of your head. So that what the website looks like is up for discussion. So I will let the chair know about that suggestion for adding a place to ask questions.
Terrific. And then Marcy Murningham's also posted a link to the charter in it, kind of in reference to what values we might use in terms of setting up the rubric. I'm going to move to breakout. Elodia, I still see your hand up. Is that legacy whole hand up or, okay, thank you. We're going to move to breakout. And in this, there's then, kind of the guidance we're offering for you in this breakout is you're going to be randomly sorted out, assigned in your breakout. It'll be about, we're running a bit behind. We'll do it for 10 minutes. It's tight time. Introduce yourselves quickly. Assign someone to report out on the top 1-2 ideas. And the point of the breakout is to brainstorm. And it's the question that I posted earlier in the chat that I will repost now. And it is to, let me get to the right, got a lot going on here. It's basically how much to invest, what to spend it on, and who benefits. So that should guide your conversation. And then we'll come back into the larger group and see what you all came up with. So I think at this point, Janice is going to assign us out to groups. In each room, there'll be some monitors to help us, kind of guidance. So you've got questions, there'll be someone to help us out a bit.
Yep, and just a friendly reminder that individual views do not necessarily reflect Watertown Forward as a whole, because we'll all be entering the rooms to have discussions as residents. So just a friendly reminder, if you get kicked out of a room or need to come back to this main room, I will be here for you if you have any questions at all. And have a great discussion. I think we're back.
Okay. Great. Are we all here? We're missing some counselors.
Yeah, we're missing. There's Tony. I see
There's
Emily.
one.
I see Emily.
And yeah, I see Emily.
Oh, here,
I'm here.
caller, if you're not here, how helpful is that? Okay. All right, so we broke into what, 3 groups?
4.
4 groups?
Mhm.
Did everybody identify 4? Did everybody identify a reporter outer?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
Okay. 2 yeses. So how am I going to identify these groups?
So
I
there's
didn't,
4 groups. My suggestion would just be to go down the line and have group 1 present, group 2, group 3, and group 4.
okay, I hope somebody paid attention what group I was in. I have no idea. So
Or you could just have people volunteer to go
okay,
first
I
if you're
think we'll
not
do it
sure.
that way.
That's fine.
All right, so looking for the first volunteer reporter to just share what you discussed, and it'd be great if you brainstormed ideas, but if you spent your time clarifying, it'd be great to hear about what were points of clarification. So looking for volunteers. Alice? I've got Alice and then Connie.
Say again?
I've got Alice and then Connie.
Okay, so I was part of group 1. We had some great discussions about priorities, and we weren't able to allocate percentages of how much, but we our suggestions were rental assistance for low income, childcare subsidies for parents, and also funds to help support childcare workers, address food insecurity in our community, and also some type of micro transportation for seniors, children, and other people that might need it. And that might also intersect with environmental concerns.
Okay. Rental assistance, childcare, food insecurity, micro transportation. Might be good to just put, if you know, I've got the headlines, we've got the recording. If you get a chance, you could make it a complete sentence in the chat. Connie.
So we had buckets that we talked about, but first we also talked about this idea of kind of being wise and choosing close-ended doable projects, and that the time is very tight on this to accomplish. So it's very important, and that we also value the participatory nature of the project, and that Watertown is choosing for it to be very democratic. So our buckets were, and we don't have we don't have a lot of details with any of these, but it was around the care economy, so both childcare and elderly care, and supporting those needs coming from that. The other piece was many people that work in Watertown can't afford to live here, so kind of whatever might be attended to in terms of affordable housing. Again, kind of a climate use of some of the monies to help ensure that Watertown is a livable, breathable place. And some of the care economy was also around renovating elderly housing. And then some of the concerns that were environmental concerns were something that Nancy had put into, but things like lead service lines and what we need to know more, but what is dangerous and how can we fix it?
Right. Okay. Next volunteers. I got 2 more groups. Dan?
So T, I think we were group 3. You and I and Marcy and Jared and Stephanie were in the group. And we didn't get so much on specific areas we'd like the funding to go to, but we talked a little bit more about the procedure. Jared, educated us a little bit further to clarify that the funding doesn't necessarily need to be spent directly by the city government of Watertown, but it can use other entities as a conduit, like non-government entities or businesses. And we also talked about, that, for the more innovative programs, new created programs, we'd want to make sure that we have some justification to explain why do we want to go down that avenue and also have some kind of measurement to measure success. I think that was the primary things that came out of that brief breakout.
Oh, yeah, it was brief. Thank you, Dan. And who is the last group? Marcy, do you have a question or comment?
I'm the,
No, I was just
Okay.
congratulating Dan on doing such a great job.
I'm the reporter, rental assistance program, and that could range from any portion of the 10.5 million. It's a kind of program that could be a 2-year program or a more 3-year program, depending on how much you want to allocate. It would benefit low-income folks. It would also benefit us as a community in general because it would keep our population diverse. And then came microtransit, and related to that, making those vehicles electric. There is some talk about more blue bikes and connecting the 2 existing shuttle services. That could range between 3 and 5 million if you did the whole package of microtransit, electric shuttles, connecting, and blue bikes. That would primarily help the elderly and the low income. And then there was a bit about infrastructure, the needs to increase funding for our roads and sidewalks.
Okay. These are great ideas. I mean, I've heard some areas of overlap, rental assistance, childcare. I mean, rental assistance come up 3 times, childcare has come up a couple of times, elderly care, microtransit's come up a couple of times. And then there's some other ideas, you know, renovating elderly housing, some, you know, the local lead lines. That's I'm pretty down in the weeds on that one. And then some good ideas on process. You know, being wise about, you know, choosing doable projects, and some gratitude for that. It's been a participatory conversation, that Watertown's intent is to be participatory. Alice, is there a comment?
Just one more, food insecurity. You didn't mention that one. That came up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And food insecurity. For our experts, you know, Jared and Emily, is there anything you've heard here that is a surprise, that is out of bounds of the guidelines, or you have suggestions about how engaged residents would want to think or develop it further?
No, I'm not surprised by anything I've heard. I guess actually maybe the microtransit thing, just mostly because I am just finding out about it right now, hearing more about people and the programs other communities offer. Thought that was interesting, but no, these seem pretty standard requests. But one thing the committee is interested in doing is engaging with people who may not be as prone to participation in the public input process, where we're going to try and reach out to the senior center, and where a lot of senior citizens don't have access to computers or email or the website, and then trying to hopefully reach out to people who don't normally participate, but we want to hear from them as well. So further engaging with a lot of more people in the community that we don't see all the time at these public meetings, because some people might not even know we're getting this money. So trying to get the word out as much as possible is going to be a key in this process.
Terrific, thank you. Dan has posted a great question in the chat. You know, where all the funds must be spent by the end of 2026, are there other creative ways that other municipalities may have funded new positions or salaries? That might be a question for you, Jared.
Yeah, I mean, I love that question because it goes to the last thing I was kind of wanting to emphasize, which is that we're kind of trained to think that the budget's a every year thing. It happens and then it just moves on. But the budget process just happens every year because we're humans and we need to set an end date and have a deadline. but like Watertown's constantly raising revenue and constantly making expenditures. Some communities are looking for ways to make expenditures with one-time money that generate revenue in the future. Watertown does this all the time. We think about this all the time, but sometimes when we think about spending the public money, we don't think about that. You know, we don't think about, well, if we spend $4 million to save on our heating bill, then we can use the revenue from that heating bill to fund a position in perpetuity, right? There's opportunities for things like that that communities are doing. What are the cost centers that, or what are places where if things were improved, then the city would be able to generate more revenue from those activities and then use that permanent ongoing revenue to fund things. I don't know the specifics. I don't know Watertown well enough to kind of go to those specifics, but I think those are good questions to ask the folks who do know the specifics is, are there opportunities where we can eliminate costs or make investments that generate revenue for the city that we can use to fund ongoing services that change the nature of the services provided by the city? I think that's a really good push to kind of keep focus, because there's a kind of a temptation to just say, let's just buy things, copper pipes, copper wire, and we'll put them in the ground and then we got the money spent. But I would challenge us all to kind of push a little further than that.
That's great. I don't even know how to get my head around that one. Tony?
Yeah, I didn't know how to get, I'm not trying to get my head around that one particularly, but I do want to, heard this now a couple of times in the meeting with George, when the last BFO meeting that Emily and the team had, a number of us were there. And this whole idea of that you can't fund things because when they end, you're falling off the cliff and you don't have any other funding for them. I just want to put that out as something I think is a red flag, a false flag, to be honest. Just as the example that Jared gave us of the city who decided for 2 years to have a office on resilience, and then you could have a rental assistance program. We've had in Watertown a rental assistance program for about 1.5 years, and then the money ran out and the program stopped. You could have a social service resource specialist, the second one, for 2 years. And then the money runs out, either they find a way to fund it, the agency, or it stops. And I think this idea of off the cliff kind of thing is a red herring. I'll give you another example. We hired our first energy consultant, I forgot his first, Ed Lewis. We hired him for $50,000 and the city. And then he went about raising his own money. And he raised enough money to keep him in the position for a couple of years before we decided to fund it completely. And so I think it's important that people keep in mind that you don't need to run the program forever, and you shouldn't use a rubric that says, unless you can run the program forever or for a long period of time, you shouldn't come up with an idea of how it's used.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tony. Jackie's put an idea in the chat that, mental health services would be another area that would be benefit by this particular funding. Tony, you've mentioned the SSRS specialist. That could be a way to invest in that area of mental health. Dan, when you posed the question, were there creative ideas that you had in mind, or were you just opening up the conversation?
Well, there were a couple of things, Tia. For one, the micro transportation of Watertown sounds great, but I guess that requires purchasing a vehicle, but also staff, having someone operate that. And secondly, Councilor Palumbo and I have been working, with the Watertown Cares, the opioid task force, and we're recommending to the city that we try to have in place a recovery coach or outreach worker. So that work can dovetail with the clinicians at Watertown PD and our SSRS. And we're hoping to fund that through, the opioid settlement funds. And I'm wondering if we can hold on to the opioid settlement funds and put them aside, use some of the ARPA funds to fund that position for a couple to the end of 2026, and then use the opioid funds to make that a longer lasting position.
Great. Thank you. I'm just kind of noting questions in the chat. Dean's asked, who is the oversight federal agency for the allocation? GAO, who's doing the federal oversight? And does our allocation plan require federal review and approval? How will it be audited? Jared?
The U.S. Treasury Department is the oversight agency for this, and they have a special department associated with the state and local fiscal stabilization funds. You'll find on the website of mine that I linked to, you'll find links to some of their official documents about it. The Watertown is required to submit an abbreviated report because it's a town under 250,000. Towns under 250,000 have a more streamlined reporting process that they're required to go through. You may hear people say that it's difficult. It is not. It is. I used to work as a government budget agent for the state of Wisconsin. We reported more about less money than this many, many times. So it's very streamlined, intended to be streamlined. So Treasury is the authors of that. So far, Treasury has only issued a couple specific rulings about misuse of funds.
I'm listening
These
to
involve states making tax cuts.
the ARPA.
So
A lot of people are
hope that helps.
suggesting.
If people could, if folks could mute, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay, so Jared, do you want to finish your thought?
Just the Treasury Department, the reporting requirements are pretty thin. We don't have to get a pre-approval. So if we spent it on, giving the money to Elon Musk, then they might take the money back from us if we couldn't justify why that was a response. But there hasn't been any cases of money being taken back yet. And so I think it's, if you stay in the boundaries, they'll probably be fine.
Great, thank you. Just noting that there's been, and I'll get to you in a minute, Tony, Bob's mentioned a shelter, and that is kind of a follow on to Dan's comment in terms of staffing for an outreach worker for opioid crisis. Did I get that right? Okay, close enough. Tony, last comment, and then we're going to move to close. So Tony?
Yeah, I just, there's a service called Route 50, which is a daily publication of various city and state issues. And one of the last publications they had was about concern that mayors of large cities were worried about the clawback of money from ARPA because of the change in leadership in the Republican Party and the Congress, and how that might be affected if there needs to be cuts in order to get a debt ceiling. And I just wondered whether Jared had heard anything about the clawback from other people and whether that was a concern.
Good question.
Well, here mechanics matter. So Watertown has the money. It's physically in the city's bank account. So the clawback would have to be to force Watertown to pay it back to the federal government. So I think that sets an additional protection, I think, in this case. Whereas if it was money that hadn't already been deposited in Watertown's bank account, then maybe the debt ceiling thing could delay payment or put it into questioning. Politically, I don't know. It sort of depends on whether you're an optimist or pessimist. I don't think that it's a winning issue to take money away from local and state government, even if it's a red administration and a blue state. It's usually not a winner to take money back out of the bank accounts. So I would proceed fairly comfortably personally. But if you feel differently about that, you might want to account for that. But I think that the fact that we possess the money, the program's been in place for a while. A lot of places already spent it. I think it'd be pretty secure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for your ideas and your suggestions and your comments and your knowledge. This has been a rich, rich, rich conversation. I want to thank particularly our speakers, Jared and Emily. Thank you so much for joining us and for all of the knowledge and ideas that have been brought. So I'm going to turn it over to Janice, who's going to close us out for the evening and give us our final marching orders.
Thank you. Yes, I just echo Tia's sentiments. I'm sad I couldn't join a breakout room. I was really curious about the conversations. And thank you to the presenters again, and to our room facilitators. That was very helpful, and to the attendees for joining these really important conversations. We will be compiling all of your good ideas and sending them to City Council to consider as they think about how best to allocate ARPA funds in Watertown. So please put any remaining ideas in the chat that are occurring to you before the end of the meeting. And you can always email us with additional suggestions. We hope to have communication with council within the next week or so. So we would just ask that if you want anything to be included, you have that to us this week. And we always make sure to look through the chat, and we'll grab everything that we didn't get to discuss today. So before you go, we do have a few important announcements that, so if anyone has their calendar they want to dig out, if you're like me, you still have a paper calendar, which I know is somewhat antiquated. I like paper to pen. So first and foremost, just a reminder, I know that Emily mentioned the next BFO meeting will be, it's actually February 1st. I don't know why that says February 2nd. That's incorrect. So yeah, that's weird. February 1st at 7 p.m. It's 7 to 9 in council chambers. And this would be a great opportunity for folks to continue their learning around ARPA. They'll have someone presenting from a different outfit who may have different information, which is great. And I know Nancy, in the chat, you had mentioned that there are some infrastructure funding questions that you would like to pose. I know there's going to be opportunity for public comment. They won't be accepting proposals at this meeting, but I'm sure you could pose some questions there that you didn't, that you are interested in asking that particular committee. And we recently held a city chat on the comprehensive plan, and we're still keeping our eye on any movement with that next draft. There is not one yet, but the scuttlebutt says it should be coming around mid-February. So we will be updating you once that happens, and linking anything relevant on our channels. And we'll be sure to make an announcement about that. And then finally, Watertown Community Conversations, which is a community leader working to increase understanding across differences through the use of dialogue, will host its next facilitator training for small group dialogue on January 27th from 5 to 7 p.m. and Sunday, January 29th from 9:45 a.m. to 4 p.m. which is a great opportunity here in Watertown. You will be learning the basic methods and skills needed to facilitate group discussions in a variety of professional or volunteer settings. Much like the meeting you are attending now, we are always looking for folks who have some experience with facilitation to join our team and help with some of our meetings. So this would be a great opportunity to sharpen skills or learn some new skills in that department. And to that end, if you liked what you saw today, we encourage you to stay connected through our channels that we listed, and we can list again for you, and or volunteer with us. Right now, we are looking for support in really managing some of our social media platforms and planning any future programming. Right now, we're just kind of sticking to the bare bones with our city chats until we have a little bit more of a support base. So we encourage you to reach out to us if you have any interest, and to attend the facilitator training, which sounds really fantastic. So please stay in touch. I think maybe I have one more slide. Let me just quickly check. That gives information on Watertown Forward. I do have another slide. So if you want to email us to join our mailing list, please do so. I will share that here. It's our webpage, our Facebook group. We don't have a ton of channels, but just your basics. We would love to hear from you, and thank you so much again for coming, and to our presenters. We hope you have a great rest of your Sunday evening, and I will leave you with a little ABBA. I work all night, I work all day, pay the bills I have to